Thank you very much for joining us. We move forward, and Myanmar's junta carried out an airstrike on a village in the centre of the country, killing at least 12 people and destroying homes and buildings. However, in recent updates, the local People's Defence Force unit reported that there have been at least 27 fatalities. The strike hit the village of Letpanhla, which is held by anti-coup fighters and lies around 60 kilometres north of the country's second biggest city of Mandalay. The number of military airstrikes on civilians has risen year on year during the civil war. Myanmar's military seized power in a 2021 coup, which has plunged the country into a fractious civil war, and analysts say the embattled junta is increasingly using airstrikes to target civilians. Witness Myint So said he tried to hide as an aircraft came in for a bombing run. Here is a witness account of what Myint So said. Well, joining us to discuss this latest strike in Myanmar is Professor Madhav Nalapat, the editorial director of the Sunday Guardian, joining us from India. Professor Nalapat, thank you very much for joining us today. Can you explain a bit more of the significance of this strike that we've seen? Potentially at least 12, up to potentially 27 people killed.
Well, I'd like to point out that these are not freedom fighters. They're not democracy fighters. They basically want to have an independent state, and they've been fighting for that for decades. Even when Aung San Suu Kyi was running Myanmar, but it's very convenient to use the Nobel Prize winner as the reason why that they are being persecuted by the military. There's no doubt the military is indulging in a lot of persecution, and I think countries should step up and support the return of Aung San Suu Kyi. But the reality is, these are hardened fighters for an independent state, and they are heavily linked also to the PLA and to China. So from that point of view, let me say that today, 1/3 of the India-Myanmar border is in effect part of the India-China border, because China controls the armed groups on the other side. The Myanmar military is finding it very difficult to control these groups. It's taking them decades, and they're not making much progress. So air is about the only way they can basically ensure that there is some, if I may say so, pushback to what these groups are doing. And they're armed groups. If there's anyone in the territories they control who are against these groups, they're made short order of. So let's not fool ourselves that these are fighters for democracy and fighters for return of Aung San Suu Kyi, although it's certainly true that she would have been much better at persuading the entire Myanmar people to return to the path of peace, and the military certainly is not one of the best exemplars of a path of peace. So from that point of view, I would urge that more democratic countries support the return to power of Aung San Suu Kyi, and I think that would help a lot in ensuring that public sentiment is such that these kind of armed groups do not get as much traction as they have been getting under the military.
Yes, and Professor Nalapat, looking at a potential reaction to this, do you think there will be more intense fighting on the region that we know has already seen large levels of violence and bloodshed over the past 4 or 5 years?
Look, we know from the experience of the Vietnam War that fighting a guerrilla war against a guerrilla army is by no means an easy task. I mean, you have forest cover, you have other kind of natural cover, and you have human shields in the form of local populations. So fighting them is very difficult. Now, Sri Lanka, which Professor Gunaratne comes from, founded LTTE because the LTTE would always hide behind civilians. The same thing is happening with these armed groups. So yes, there's no doubt that bombing is indiscriminate, that not only the militants, but also innocent civilians are going to be killed. There's no doubt about that. But the Myanmar army has no other way of dealing with the situation, because if you have any kind of an effort to subdue them on the ground, the casualties are going to be extremely high, including civilian casualties. We saw that happen again in Sri Lanka. We have seen that happen, for example, long back in Vietnam, and it will happen in Myanmar as well. So the military has recourse only to the air weapon for its, and the odd thing is, the military is very friendly to China. So on the one hand, the Chinese are backing a movement which is totally hostile to the military, and on the other hand, you have military that is friendly to China, but that's almost by default, I'd like to say. I mean, in countries in Europe, for example, they completely shun the military junta. India, of course, does not, but countries in Europe do. And as a consequence, they are pushed into the arms of China. And if I may say so, the same thing is happening with Russia. Russia is being pushed more and more into the strategic embrace of China because of policies towards it. President Trump had a sensible policy of trying to ensure that Russia was somehow decoupled from China, but he seems to have switched that policy in the last few days. And unless he goes back to the earlier policy of trying to ensure that Russia, is made a friend rather than enemy, well, this close alliance between Russia and China is only going to increase.
Professor Madhav Nalapat, thank you very much for your insight there. That is all we do have time for, but we will continue to bring you more of the latest international news very soon.